Just before 11 in the morning, a woman sends her mother a text message from the middle of a gym. "He's turned up at the gym and come next to me," it says. Moments later, she calls her instead. Her mother tells her to go straight home. She listens. She leaves the gym, walks to her car in the shopping center car park, and gets inside. It is the last completely ordinary decision she will ever make, because the man she has just left behind gets into the car with her. 12 days earlier, she had ended their relationship. Twice in the week before this morning, she had gone to the police about him. Her own messages to friends, in the days leading up to this moment, describe feeling watched, feeling on edge, feeling scared of exactly what might happen next. This is the case of Molly McLaren and her ex-boyfriend, Joshua Stimpson. Now, if this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found this channel. Every day, I dive deep into real criminal cases, breaking them down piece by piece so we can actually understand what happened and why. If that sounds like something you'd be into, go ahead and hit subscribe. It's free, and it means a lot. Okay, now let's get back to the case. Molly McLaren was 23 years old. She was a student at the University of Kent, and by all accounts from the people who knew her academic work best, she was on track to graduate with a first-class honours degree, the kind of result that comes from genuine effort and ability rather than simply getting by. She lived in Cobham, Kent, close to her parents, Doug and Joanne McLaren, and remained close with them throughout her adult life, a fact that would matter enormously in the final days before her death. Friends who spoke about her afterwards described a young woman who was thoughtful enough to check in on the people close to her, even while she herself was navigating a difficult and increasingly frightening situation. In November of 2016, Molly matched with a man named Joshua Stimpson on the dating app Tinder. What followed was a relationship that lasted 7 months, one she would eventually decide, on her own terms, to bring to an end. By June of 2017, Molly was a young woman with a bright future genuinely within reach, a degree nearly completed, a close relationship with her family, and a decision behind her that she believed, correctly, was the right one for her own well-being. What she could not have known was how dangerous that correct decision was about to become. There is something worth noting about the ordinariness of Molly's daily routine in those final weeks. She continued going to her regular gym. She continued texting her mother throughout the day, the way any close family does. She continued living her life exactly as she should have been able to, studying, training, staying in touch with the people she loved, even as the person she had recently ended things with was making that life increasingly difficult to feel safe in. Joshua Stimpson was 26 years old, working as a double glazing salesman based in Woodham, near Rochester in Kent. To Molly, in the early months of their relationship, he would have presented as an ordinary partner, someone she had met the way millions of people meet each other now, through a dating app, with no immediate reason for concern. What later emerged in court painted a very different picture of the man underneath that ordinary presentation. A psychiatrist who assessed Stimpson after his arrest described him as having a profound hypersensitivity to rejection, a trait the court heard traced back to his teenage years, when his mother left the family. That early experience of abandonment, according to the evidence presented, had shaped him into someone described as emotionally unstable, driven by what was termed a highly abnormal personality. In the years that followed, he had been repeatedly referred to a mental health clinic, but had resisted meaningful engagement with treatment, reportedly hoping, in the psychiatrist's words, that the simple fix was to take a tablet. There was also a documented pattern that predated his relationship with Molly entirely. 4 years earlier, while living in Stoke-on-Trent, Stimpson had gone on a date with another woman. Afterwards, he harassed her over text messages and was suspected of slashing the tires on her mother's car. That earlier behaviour was reported to Staffordshire police at the time, but was never recorded as a crime, and the matter was closed after Stimpson was simply sent a warning text message. This is the shape so many of these relationships take before anyone recognizes the danger for what it is. Not a man who announced himself as dangerous from the very first date, but a pattern, repeating itself across different relationships and different parts of the country, each time going unrecognized as part of anything larger until it eventually reached Molly McLaren. To Molly herself, in the early stages of their relationship, none of this history would have been visible or even accessible. Dating in the modern era rarely comes with any way of learning about a new partner's past beyond what they choose to share directly. She had no realistic way of knowing, when she matched with him on Tinder, that she was entering a relationship with a man whose response to rejection had already, once before, escalated into harassment and suspected property damage against someone else entirely. On the 17th of June 2017, during a night out, Molly ended her relationship with Joshua Stimpson. Her own words, shared with friends around that time, described feeling pressured by him and constantly treading on eggshells in his presence. She had, by her own account, simply stopped feeling attracted to him and found his behavior demanding and childish. Stimpson's response began almost immediately. He started posting derogatory comments and photographs about Molly on Facebook, including false claims that she used cocaine. He went further still, tagging her own mother, Joanne, directly in these posts, ensuring her family would see them regardless of whether Molly wanted them to. Police were made aware and told him to stop. He continued anyway. On the 22nd of June, 5 days after the breakup, Molly and her mother went together to Kent Police to report what was happening. 3 days later, on the 25th of June, more derogatory posts appeared, prompting the two of them to return to the police a second time. Throughout this period, Molly's own words to friends captured exactly how frightened she had become. In one message, she wrote that she was actually scared of what he might do, scared he might hurt her, and unsure how close to the edge he really was. The night before her death, she encountered Stimpson unexpectedly at a pub, despite having been told by police that they had already spoken to him. Her friend later described her as physically shaking afterwards. By the morning of the 29th of June, Molly had done everything that is typically recommended to someone in her position. She had ended the relationship clearly. She had reported the ongoing harassment to police, twice, within the space of a single week. She had confided in her friends and her family about exactly how frightened she was. None of it changed what was about to happen. It is worth pausing on just how compressed this entire timeline actually was. From the morning she died, within that short window, she experienced online harassment severe enough to involve her mother directly, made 2 separate visits to a police station, and still managed to maintain her ordinary routine, her studies, her gym sessions, her daily contact with her family. There was no lengthy period in which warning signs quietly built without anyone noticing. Everything that mattered happened rapidly, visibly, and was actively being reported to the authorities as it unfolded. On the morning of the 29th of June 2017, Molly went to Pure Gym at the Dockside retail outlet in Chatham, Kent, for what should have been an ordinary workout. CCTV footage later shown in court captured Joshua Stimpson walking up and down the gym's stairs twice before entering the fitness suite himself and deliberately placing his exercise mat down beside hers. At 45 minutes past 10 that morning, Molly texted her mother, telling her that Stimpson had turned up at the gym and come next to her. She then phoned her directly. Her mother told her to go straight home. Molly left the gym and walked to her car in the Dockside car park. Stimpson followed her and got into the vehicle alongside her. Using a knife he had purchased from an Asda store 2 days earlier, he launched what prosecutors would later describe as a frenzied attack. stabbing her more than 75 times as she sat trapped inside her own car, including a wound to her throat. The prosecution told the court that Stimpson had carefully considered the execution of the attack, following Molly's movements and waiting for the moment he had chosen to act. Emergency services arrived and worked to save her, but despite prompt medical attention, Molly McLaren died at the scene. Police found Stimpson wandering near the site shortly afterwards, his clothing visibly covered in blood, and arrested him immediately. A search of his car uncovered not only the knife used in the attack, but 2 additional Stanley knives and a pickaxe, suggesting a level of preparation that went well beyond a single moment of impulsive rage. Stimpson was charged with murder. Ahead of his trial at Maidstone Crown Court, he entered a guilty plea to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, while continuing to deny murder. The case proceeded to a full trial regardless, requiring Molly's family to sit through detailed evidence of exactly what had happened to her. After hearing that evidence, a jury of 8 men and 4 women took less than 4 hours to unanimously find Joshua Stimpson guilty of murder. Sentencing him, Judge Adele Williams described the killing as a cruel, calculated and cowardly act, telling Stimpson directly that he had slit Molly's throat while repeatedly stabbing her, determined to punish her for ending the relationship and seeking nothing less than revenge. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 26 years and was warned he may never be released, on the basis that he remained a highly dangerous young man who would pose a considerable risk to women for a considerable period into the future. The detective who led the investigation said afterwards that it had been clear to both the jury and to investigators that Molly's death was pre-planned, and that Stimpson was a cold and calculated killer rather than someone lacking the mental capacity to control himself. By denying murder and refusing to accept full responsibility until a jury forced the issue, he had required Molly's family and friends to endure the additional distress of a full Crown Court trial, one that could otherwise have been avoided entirely. Because Joshua Stimpson never disputed that he had killed Molly McLaren, the central forensic battle at trial was never about identity, but about intent, the line between manslaughter and murder resting entirely on what the evidence could establish about his state of mind and planning. The knife purchased 2 days before the attack, the additional Stanley knives and pickaxe recovered from his car, and the CCTV showing him tracking her through the gym before positioning himself beside her, together built a picture prosecutors used to argue against any sudden, unplanned loss of control. The decisive medical evidence came from psychiatric assessment. While Stimpson's hypersensitivity to rejection had likely affected his judgment and self-control, it had not impaired his basic understanding of what he was doing. That distinction let the jury hold both truths at once: real underlying psychological difficulty and a killing built on clear intent rather than an uncontrollable break from reality. As with any analysis of this kind, nothing here is intended as a clinical diagnosis. What follows is drawn directly from the psychiatric evidence presented at trial, considered alongside broader research into stalking behavior and violence following relationship breakdown. At the center of this case sits a psychological profile that researchers who study intimate partner violence recognize as a genuinely high-risk combination: an intense, disproportionate fear of abandonment, paired with an inability to accept that a relationship has ended on the other person's terms. The court heard that this pattern in Stimpson traced back to adolescence, to his mother leaving the family home, an experience the psychiatrist described as having affected him more significantly than it might affect others. Whatever its origin, by the time he was an adult, that sensitivity to rejection had become, in the words used at trial, a highly abnormal personality trait, one he had never meaningfully addressed despite repeated referrals to mental health services. The pattern involving his previous partner in Staffordshire, already described, is significant here not because it proves anything about what would eventually happen to Molly, but because it demonstrates that this was not an isolated response to one specific relationship. Researchers who study stalking behavior describe this kind of cross-relationship pattern as one of the clearest indicators of genuine risk, distinct from a single instance of a difficult breakup. The specific combination the court ultimately weighed, real psychological difficulty on one hand and clear, documented planning on the other, is what made this case psychologically complex without making it legally ambiguous. Stimpson's own actions in the days before the attack, buying a weapon in advance, tracking Molly's location, waiting for a specific moment, demonstrated a level of goal-directed behavior that sits uneasily alongside any suggestion of someone acting purely on uncontrollable impulse. The jury's verdict reflected exactly that tension, acknowledging his underlying difficulties while still holding him fully accountable for a killing they concluded had been planned rather than merely lost to a moment of emotional collapse. There is a further pattern worth naming here, one that researchers who study stalking specifically describe as escalation following separation. Stimpson's behavior did not begin at its most dangerous point. It moved, in a matter of days, from online harassment to appearing uninvited at a pub, to physically following Molly to her gym and waiting for the precise moment she was alone. Each step on its own might have been assessed in isolation as concerning but not necessarily lethal. Together, viewed as a single escalating sequence, they described exactly the trajectory that stalking researchers warn is most likely to end in serious violence, particularly in the days and weeks immediately following a relationship's end. There is a detail in this case that deserves to be examined entirely on its own, separate from everything else, because of how directly it challenges a common and deeply held assumption. Molly McLaren did not stay silent. She did not hide what was happening to her. She ended the relationship clearly and unambiguously. She confided in her friends about exactly how frightened she was. She went to the police, not once, but twice, in the space of a single week, specifically because of the harassment she was experiencing. By any conventional measure of what someone in a dangerous situation is advised to do, Molly McLaren did all of it. She was killed 5 days after her second report to police. This is an uncomfortable fact to sit with, precisely because so much public conversation around stalking and relationship violence centers on encouraging victims to speak up, to report, to seek help early, all of which is genuinely sound advice, and none of which guaranteed Molly's safety in this specific case. The failure here was not a failure of Molly's own judgment or actions. It was a failure of the systems meant to respond once she had already done everything right. That failure extended beyond a single police force. The Staffordshire allegation from 4 years earlier, had it been properly recorded and connected to his name at the time, might have painted an entirely different risk picture when Molly and her mother walked into a Kent police station in the final days of June 2017. Instead, that history existed in a different county, under a different police force, effectively invisible to the officers assessing Stimpson's risk to Molly in real time. It is a far more specific and uncomfortable one, that a victim doing everything right can still be let down by a system that fails to connect the dots, sitting right in front of it, sometimes separated by nothing more than a county line. It is worth being fair to the officers who took Molly's reports in those final days. Handling a harassment complaint days before it escalates into a killing is, by definition, something that can only be judged with certainty in hindsight. What this case exposes is less about any single decision made by any individual officer, and more about the structural gap between separate police forces holding separate, unconnected pieces of the same picture. Molly's report in Kent existed entirely apart from a record in Staffordshire that, had it been visible, might have changed how seriously her final warnings were weighed. Following Molly's death, a formal domestic homicide review was carried out by the Kent and Medway Community Safety Partnerships, examining exactly how her case and the warning signs surrounding it had been handled. The review confirmed that Staffordshire police had failed to adequately investigate the allegations made against Stimpson 4 years earlier. At the same time, it concluded that the training given to Kent police officers was robust, and that the reports made by Molly and her mother in the days before her death had been dealt with appropriately and proportionately, a conclusion her parents have continued to question publicly in the years since. The review's recommendations included asking Staffordshire police to demonstrate how a similar case would be handled differently today, and calling on the Home Office to lead a national campaign addressing coercive and controlling behaviour. In the aftermath of the case, Kent police also introduced TechSOS, a GPS-based personal safety device for vulnerable victims, allowing covert emergency contact with police alongside real-time location tracking. Molly's father, Doug McLaren, later reflected publicly on what might have been different, saying that had Kent police been able to trace the earlier allegation in Staffordshire, it might have raised the alarm needed to change the outcome entirely. It is, by its nature, a question that can never be fully answered. There is one more part of Molly's story worth telling, separate from the investigation and the courtroom. As a teenager, Molly had faced her own private battle with an eating disorder and had come through it. In the years since her death, her family and friends have channeled their grief into the Molly McLaren Foundation, a charity built in her name that funds long-term therapy for young people struggling with eating disorders and supports the families around them too. It is not a courtroom outcome or a policy recommendation. It is simply what the people who loved her chose to build out of what was left, a way of making sure something good kept growing from a life that was cut short. What is certain is that Molly McLaren did everything within her power to protect herself in her final days, and it was the response around her, not any failure of her own, that could not keep pace with the danger she had already correctly identified. It is worth ending, as always, with who Molly actually was. A university student on track for a first-class degree, a daughter close enough to her parents to call her mother from the middle of a gym the moment she felt unsafe, a young woman who had already fought one battle privately and won it, who recognized a second, very different danger clearly, named it honestly to the people around her, and did precisely what she was supposed to do. She deserved a system capable of matching that clarity with action of its own. If you want to understand how a victim can do everything right and still be failed by the systems meant to protect her, that is exactly what this channel is for. Every day, we break these cases down properly, without the noise, so hit subscribe if that is something you want more of. Thank you for watching.